American Experience just did about the King's later years, and they really focused on, King trying to go to Harlem or go to Chicago to do organizing, and it just backfired. It just flopped. It failed. And not to just think of Dr. King, I think he would admit to this day, yeah, it sucked. It really just didn't work. Because the set of conditions were so different, right, in those ways. And the other thing I'm also leaving out, in terms of not just sort of transience and instability, but also an issue of just really trust and support, right? If we've lived in the same community for 40 years, right, or longer, and in some cases, and even to this day, you can go to places in the South, and older black people will refer to particular places as Johnson Plantation or whatever, Jones Plantation or whatever. So those notions really haven't disappeared altogether. But if we've lived in the same place for, our families have lived in the same place, there's a certain level of trust in whatever we have, right? I could, I'm more willing to take a risk. I'm more willing to get beat by some cops. I'm more willing to get, turn water hoses on if I know the people around me have my back, right? Because we've had that kind of history together as individuals, our families, we go to the same church, whatever. I'm going to take those kind of risks. You just moved into me next door in a tenement 6 months ago. I don't know you. I'm not going to take those same kind of risks, right? So those are some things that made doing some of that work and some of the tensions that we saw with that beginning to develop at that point between SNCC and SCLC, because a lot of SNCC was certainly did a lot of work in the South, but you also had a lot of SNCC members, in particular, who came from other places. Stokely Carmichael, who became, changed his name to Kwame Ture, was from New York, and originally from, I think, Trinidad. His family was from. So, you had a different set of concerns, right? One of the other things that also happened during this period and also begins to kind of surface towards the end of the sort of civil rights movement into the Black Power period are some real issues around gender and sexuality and sexual orientation, right? Which don't really get talked about in this section of the film. And one of them is, and so that tension is really kind of about the direction, and I think the fundamental kind of identity or how people even thought of what a movement or what liberation sort of would mean, right? And for some people in the community, a certain level of sexism, patriarchy, and homophobia began to get exposed through this while trying to sort of vie for power within some of these different organizations in the direction of the movement, right? So with A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, who they talk about in the film, or who they show actual footage from, they're just sort of two figures where we can talk about some of those tensions. How many people know who Bayard Rustin was? Besides what you just saw, kind of helped do some stuff with the civil rights movement. Okay, 1, 2 people, okay. So Bayard Rustin was a long time, and by all accounts, brilliant organizer. The man could organize his behind off, right? He had come out of a history of doing labor organizing, of doing anti-war and kind of pacifism, peace organizing from World War II into the 40s and 50s. And he was also a black gay man, right? And was very out at that time, right? Very out. Everybody knew. Wasn't no secret. And part of what happened was, in the 1950s, he got arrested in Los Angeles, I think, on a public indecency charge. He was making out with some guy in a car, right? And cops rolled up and, whatever, he got arrested. So that was on his record. And certainly his different early in his organizing career, his ties to different sort of Marxist or socialist or communist organizations within the U.S. was also part of what ends up happening later with him. But anyway, so when King first went to Montgomery, not Birmingham, but went to Montgomery around the time of the bus boycott in the 1950s, King was 26, I think, and a very inexperienced organizer, right? Folks knew he was smart, really, really smart, had a passion for it, was, you know, capable in other ways, but hadn't really pulled off any major kind of demonstrations. Who do they send to go kind of school him to do the Montgomery bus boycott? They send Bayard, right? So him and Bayard, Bayard becomes his mentor, right? And then no, I'm not coloring that. Bayard was like King's mentor, taught him really everything he knew about organizing. Now, by the time we get to the early 60s, when they're beginning to put together the March on Washington for 63, Bayard was named the principal organizer of the 1963 March on Washington, right? And then some things happened that, like, thwart that. Basically what happened is that through some, what's sort of weird about, to me, this period is like, there were ways in which the government, essentially, through the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, are communicating with people within the movement, right? And there's people there, basically, some communication happens. I can't remember specifically how this happens, but it basically comes from Hoover that you have a known, like, you know, sodomite or whatever the language was they used, who's going to be the public face of this major demonstration you're going to pull off, and we'll expose that, and we'll make sure that this is completely, like, shot. Like anything, like you won't be able to pull the people to come because of that. All these things, right? Will basically, you know, make it blow up in your face, right? So because of that, Bayard voluntarily stepped out of the public eye as the main organizer of the 1963 March on Washington, though he really did all the organizing work for it, but stepped out of the spotlight, and A. Philip Randolph gets the credit for it in history. And that now is become, people know that. There's another film that PBS did, it came out last year, called Brother Outsider, completely about Bayard Rustin, right, which details some more of these things, right? So, and then later what ends up happening, King goes to New York to try to organize tenants in Harlem, and you have the Harlem congressional representative, Adam Clayton Powell. Sorry, it was about to leave me. Adam Clayton Powell, you know, threatens King because he also doesn't want like political, like, tensions in the black community. He doesn't want King to come to Harlem and start no mess, right? But he's, you know, it's like, if you know anything living in New York about, like, New York politics, people, they're very territorial, right, about, you know, whatever. And so, like, the Harlem, you know, kind of political bloc is still to this day one to be reckoned with, right? And so Adam Clayton Powell is like, don't come up here starting no mess, right? I don't want you riling Harlem up, you know, I don't want no mess, cut it. And so he then threatens King. King is like, well, I'm coming anyway. He threatens King and says, oh, I'll put a rumor out that you and Bayard are sleeping together, right? I'll, like, feed that to the press, right? And, you know, see what happens, right? And so King, for a while, a year or two, distances himself from Bayard as well, you know, because of those, like, you know, kind of underlying tensions around, you know, kind of sexual orientation within the movement. He eventually gets over that, and they kind of repair their friendship or whatever, and Bayard kind of steps back into the scene and works with King.